Okay, thanks very much to Phil and the folks here at Bulls Farming for having us out here and for this invitation to come down from Davis. My name is Dan Putnam. I'm from UC Davis, and I'm the statewide alfalfa specialist. We have research plots all over the state of California, some in Fresno County, up in the Intermountain area, down in the El Centro area. And we also conduct educational programs for within cooperative extension. We have, by the way, I wanted to do a little crass promotion here. In December of this year, we'll have the California Alfalfa and Grains Symposium, which will be held in Sacramento. So we'll combine, for the first time actually ever, wheat and alfalfa. And that'll be December 10th, 11th, and 12th. And we're going to also have a tour of the Delta region here, agricultural tour of the Delta, which should be quite good. I wanted to make just a few comments first on the issue of sustainability. So I wanted to have everybody raise your hand if you're into non-sustainable agriculture. Raise your hand, please. Okay, so we don't have anybody of that type here. Well, I think it's one thing that, it's a concept that I take quite seriously, and I think all of us should take seriously. It's kind of like the concept of human health, in my view. That is, we all know kind of what a healthy body is like, but you can't really quite define it. You can't really say, well, and whether somebody's healthier than somebody else, it's kind of hard to, it's kind of in that in-between area, a little bit fuzzy. But I had the opportunity to visit Saudi Arabia about 8 or 10 years ago, and they grow wheat and alfalfa and other crops in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, and they pump water for these crops from sources that will only be replenished in about 1 million or 2 million years. So will never be replenished in human history. And so I would call that sort of your definition of a non-sustainable agricultural practice, that ultimately it's a dead end. And I think all of us realize that if you have waters that are renewable, at least in theory, that either from rainfall or from snowmelt or from groundwater that gets recharged easily, that is a theoretically at least a sustainable system. If you have soils that can be maintained over periods of time, and can be prevented from eroding and that sort of thing, I think those are at least theoretically can be sustainable systems. And so I think we all have to really raise the flag of this issue of sustainability in agriculture and take it very seriously, because it's something we want to see the next 6 generations of Bulls farming here, rather than having it say, well, we'll farm for 2 years and then we're gone. So I think that's just a comment I'd like to make. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a little bit about alfalfa, and particularly about issues associated with stand establishment. And I'd like anybody how many of you grow alfalfa? Okay, quite a few of you. Okay, chime in if you disagree with what I'm saying, or if you have modifications to what I'm saying. But I put down here is this luck or skill. Well, it's going to be a combination of both, and I think that there's definitely some practices that we would recommend for stand establishment that are a series of what we call best management practices, or recommended techniques for successful stand establishment. First of all, I think the best strategy for long-term insect and weed prevention is a successful stand establishment technique. It's hard to overemphasize the importance of stand establishment. I'd say somewhere between 60 and 80% of the success of an alfalfa crop is right during that period of time when you're establishing the crop. So we think that it's a pretty critical series. Now, on this handout I've given you, there's a chart here which shows the development of alfalfa, which goes from a very, very small seeded crop. We call it a wimp, because if you plant alfalfa in say the fall or the spring of the year, it begins growing, and it's very, very weak seedling. It has very little ability to compete with weeds at that point in its lifetime, little ability to sustain cold and harsh conditions, or excessive rainfall, or other kinds of problems. And so we need to bring that crop from a weak annual, essentially a weak annual, like any kind of weak seedling, to a very strong and vigorous crop like the one you see here, which can sustain years of hacking away at it, which is what we do with alfalfa crops. And so we need to bring it from that status of a weak annual to a very strong perennial. And so those of you who may not be familiar with alfalfa, and I'm not sure, I can't probably dig up an entire plant here. Oh yeah, okay, I got it. Not entire plant, but you can see the taproot here. The taproot in alfalfa is really what we want to farm for that first 4 months of the life of the crop. We want to maybe farm for the roots rather than the shoots. And so if you look at the seedling of alfalfa, there's a node which is called the cotyledonary node, which over the period of about a month or two gets pulled down into the soil and becomes what we call the crown. And so this is actually kind of a small one. I don't know if Phil or Mohammed, you could pull up another one that's a little bit bigger. But you can see that this crown is capable of regrowing. It has many buds associated with that crown, and is capable of regrowing after cutting many times after that. So that first, say, 2 to 4 month period, we want to farm in such a way to encourage deep and vigorous roots. Let's not worry as much about whether we get top growth or not during that period of time. So what does it take to do that? Well, the first thing is soil preparation and soil, thinking about the tillage issues associated with that crop, and site selection. So if we have a salt affected soil, we obviously have a bigger problem. We have to think through how to reclaim that soil. Alfalfa isn't recommended as your first crop. If you go into a reclaimed soil, you should really think about a more salt tolerant crop like for example barley or sugar beets. I guess we can't grow those anymore around here. There's no market for them. Okay, here's another one. But you might be able to follow it with alfalfa. Tillage, and particularly deep tillage on heavy clay soils to remove any kind of subsurface impediments to deep root growth, is one of the key issues. I'm not sure if, where's Ken? Is Cannon here?
Right here.
Cannon, do you do deep tillage here?
Yeah, we do. We actually do. We use a D9 too, which a lot of folks don't use out here. Get down about 33 to 6 inches.
Right, 33 to 36 inches, something like that. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've been to sites where I've seen poor growth in the alfalfa, and I say, okay, dig me some holes. A lot of farmers, one of the best diagnostic tools for alfalfa is a backhoe. Go out there, see what's going on down below the ground. And I was in Egypt earlier last year, just before the revolution. My brother accused me of causing that. I swear it was not me. It was, I left before all that happened. They had sandy soils, which were absolute beach sands. You would not imagine. These are wind-blown deserts where they were pumping water, again, from aquifers. And they didn't realize that they had subsurface layers, even in those sands. And I dug down and I was a little puzzled too, but you could see these very fine layers of fine particles, and there's a photograph here, I don't know if you can see that on the left there, of the roots that would come down to that layer, and that's the extent of their growth. You would not get that deep taproot developing in that kind of soil, and so I recommended that they do deep tillage, in spite of the fact that they felt that they were farming essentially in beach sands. And they did have layering there that was interfering with root growth. And
we also plant a grain crop ahead of it to make sure the soil's nice and dry by the time we get in, so we can shatter that ground down deep. And so we make sure that we set up the planting in a way that we can get that deep
tillage and the fracturing that you need to do. And on these heavier soils that are part of old swampy areas, for example, where you have pretty tight soils, if you don't do something like that, and I have a lot of respect for people who have understood the dynamics of how wet it needs to be, how dry it needs to be in order to accomplish fracturing of deep tillage. It's a rather touchy deal because you can't be too wet and you can't be too dry. So there's some real issues there. So both of these were taken in fields where you have significant subsurface impediments. And so that's one of the things that we would recommend. The next thing is surface preparation for and particularly for irrigation management long term on these check flood irrigated soils. The money invested in leveling and in are using GPS now, Cannon?
Yeah.
Yeah, so most of them have moved away from laser leveling to GPS type of systems, and they're fairly accurate. I think they're really pretty good at setting up your irrigation systems. Irrigation, if we talk about stand establishment as being 60% of your success, irrigation is another big chunk, and of course a lot of that has to do with how you set up the fields from the very beginning. So site selection and tillage and land leveling. For small seeded legumes like alfalfa, we would recommend a firm but relatively loose seed bed on the surface so that the seed is not planted too deep. One of the biggest mistakes that alfalfa growers make is planting their seed too deep. We often see, somebody says, well, I put the seed in the grain drill and went at it. And they don't look at their grain drill to see how deep it's actually planting the seed. They don't test the depth. Oftentimes they don't even calibrate it to make sure they're doing the right seeding rate. So basically you would develop the soil to the point where you get about a ½ an inch of give in the soil. So you roll it to the extent where you can have firm seed beds. For example, this would be too fluffy for my liking for planting alfalfa. It's just too loose, so there's too much of a chance for the seed to fall too deeply into the soil. And as a result, that small seeded crop does not have a lot of energy. It really cannot emerge from that depth. We have a chart on the next page here showing the influence of seeding depth on emergence. And as you get down to below a ½ an inch, you have a significant problem with emergence, and depending upon soil type. On sandier soils, a little more forgiving than these heavier clay soils. But there definitely is an effect of seedling depth on seed depth on seedling emergence. Going back here to one of the issues that I think a lot of growers make a mistake on, and that is time of seeding. We were talking a little bit with Joe Machado here before that we here in California, we're somewhat spoiled. Come on, I mean, we can go out in the middle of January and we can plant a crop and actually expect it to do something. If you're in Missouri, you really can't do that. If you're in Minnesota, certainly not. We do have that capability of being able to go in any time of the year as long as the weather permits and putting a crop in. And we actually did some seeding this year in late January and February because we had such an open year. We would recommend an early fall planting fairly uniformly across the San Joaquin Valley as the optimum time for planting. And doesn't mean you can do it every year and every time, but certainly we see both short-term effects on yield and productivity and longer-term effects on both yield and crop performance with an earlier fall planting. And the question is always one of, well, wait a minute, I've got to go out and irrigate that stupid thing, that crop in September and October because there's no rainfall to bring that crop up. And the answer that I would give is that it's almost always worth it to do that because you're giving that crop a big head start on the suboptimum conditions that we see in late November, December, January, and even early February, where we can either have excess rains in some cases as you get further north. You can have frost conditions and particularly weedy conditions that come in. Those winter weed complex that we have here in California comes in basically late November and becomes very, very competitive. And I think somebody here is doing organic alfalfa. Some people are doing organic alfalfa. We have an experiment over at Kearney Field Station here this year on organic alfalfa on a certified field. They have a big problem with fiddleneck. How many people know fiddleneck? How many people love fiddleneck? All right, nobody loves fiddleneck. It's a poisonous weed. It's hard on livestock. It's something that's very difficult to deal with because it's very voracious, produces lots of seed. And so they had a heavy infestation of fiddleneck on this particular Kearney Field Station site. So we came in and we did a time of seeding study there with an early irrigated planting a late fall planting, which is typical of what you would do if you wanted to rely on rainfall to bring the crop up. And then we did an early spring planting and a late spring planting. And of all of those treatments, the second one, which is actually pretty commonly done here in the state of California, where people wait till rainy season to put their crop in, that one failed completely. And it failed for two reasons. One, it was actually, we didn't have very much rain, and we did irrigate it, but at the same time, we had a very poor stand. It was cold during that period of time. We had suboptimum growth conditions. The early seeding did very well. We still had fiddleneck in there. We came in the early spring and did a clipping, or in some cases they would do a grazing, which would be often very successful under dry conditions, to graze off that mixture between the weed and the crop, and to allow the crop, which at that point then is almost a full perennial, because if you graze it off when it's in that weak wimpy stage that I described earlier, you have more risk that the crop will actually not survive even a grazing. So that's what's the problem with a late fall planting. I've been into some organic fields where they've gone in late in the year and they're out there in February scratching their heads because the weeds are up like this, and that little tiny alfalfa seedling is like this big, and they say, what do I do?
Dan, what were the dates of the early and the late fall?
Okay, so the early planting was late September. I think it was maybe early October. So it was early October. The second planting date was late November, kind of around Thanksgiving. And then the early spring was February. And then the late spring was late April. And the spring plantings actually worked. All of them now have worked pretty well, except for that second one. The second one was a complete failure. We went back in and replanted it in the spring. So, the problem with the spring plantings is that you lose significant amounts of yield. There's a reason that you're losing yield. Probably on the order of at least 1, maybe 2 tons per acre in that first year, and a yield loss of a fall planting, of a spring planting compared with a fall planting. But more than that, in the spring, what happens is the day length is different. All right, so in the fall, you have what? Shorter days, cooler conditions. So what happens to the alfalfa plant under those conditions? It favors root growth over shoot growth. So you have actually, the plant is growing, but it's putting most of its resources into the root development. In the spring, the opposite is happening. You have longer days continuing. You have most of the resources of the plant, water, nutrients, going into shoot growth at the expense of root growth. And so you get, and we'll dig the roots up this fall at Kearney to see whether I'm right or not. But I'm pretty sure that if you dig up the roots of the fall planted versus the spring planted crop, you're going to see some big differences in the root development. And that's why, at least philosophically, I would like to see alfalfa growers farm that first 2 to 4 months for the roots, developing that root system, so that you have deep, well-developed crowns and roots to sustain what I call it alfalfa abuse. We go in there at 28 days and hack away at it every month or so. We drive over it 4 times every cutting and so forth. So we need to have that well-developed root system to sustain that kind of abuse. And so, yeah.
Are your seeding rates different from fall planting versus spring planting?
Probably not that different. And I'll talk about seeding rates here if you'd like. How many people plant 30 or 40 pounds per acre? How many plant 50? Good, maybe somebody's been listening. Or maybe the seed price is too high, right, Joe?
Never too high.
Never too high. We for many years never recommended over 25 pounds per acre seeding rates. In fact, we have data that shows you can bring that seeding rate down to about 15 pounds per acre under ideal conditions, and under good seed bed preparation conditions, and under good seed depth control. In fact, there's a series of experiments that were done that said you can even go down to 12 pounds per acre if you have good control over seeding depth and other kinds of preparation.
I was interested in your discussion about planting depth. Is the issue emergence with planting depth, or is the issue that even with emergence you can get compromised future growth depending upon if you're planting it too deep?
Yeah, it's actually some of both, because that there's really not much residual storage energy in those very small seeded crops, as there is in corn, for example. Corn is a fairly large seeded crop, or even wheat. I mean, they have plenty of endosperm there, but. In the case of these small seeded crops, there's two issues. One is crusting. Crusting is actually a big problem with alfalfa, which is why we generally recommend a lot of growers do sprinkling. I don't know if Phil or Cannon, do you just sprinkle your crop up? Yeah, we generally recommend, that's the ideal situation if you have sprinklers, to sprinkle your crop up initially, even if you're going to flood irrigate them later, because you're able to give small amounts of water just to control the moisture in that upper period. You can flood up alfalfa crops. I've seen it done. It's more risky, especially risky if you go late in the season, but it can be done. It's cheaper, but it's certainly a higher risk than sprinkling up crop. And there's a lot of advantages to putting that sprinkler out there, because you can just give it a short run if you just get a little crusting in the top and control that crust. And that's a really key issue, particularly, I guess these are crusting type of soils here, right? Yeah. So it's particularly on some soil types, it's a really big problem. Okay, so these are a whole combinations of things. I'm going to get to the variety issue in a moment, because I think variety selection is one of those stand establishment issues that is really important. So seeding depth and rate is extremely important. And with all the improved genetics that we're seeing now, with seed becoming more expensive, say with Roundup Ready or other kinds of improved genetics, in fact, I'm going to get to this point in a minute, is that I really don't think you should look at the seed price that closely. You should look at the performance of that variety very closely, but the seed price, probably not that important. But at the same time, because we have more expensive genetics now, that's a really incentive for us to say, let's look at our seeding techniques more carefully so that we're doing a good job of seedbed preparation. We have lower chance of failure, and we can lower that seeding rate to save on seed costs if we do a better job of our methodology with seeding depth and rate. So who knows if we have improved genetics in the future of $10 or $15 a pound alfalfa seed. That's going to be a real bite for a lot of growers, but at the same time I think you can control those costs if the improved genetics are worth it by controlling your method of seeding. So plant density, I have a chart here on the next page here, keeping in mind that if you plant 35 or 40 pounds of alfalfa seed, certainly the seed company will love you, but at the same time, the percent survival of those heavy seeding rates really is much lower than in a lighter seeding rate. And so actually after one or two cuttings, you end up with approximately the same density anyway. So it's really kind of a expenditure that may not be worth it. And particularly we would look for numbers of stems per unit area as being much more important than the numbers of plants per unit area. So generally over about 40 stems per square foot is where you want to be. If you're 40, 50, 60 stems per square foot, you're in pretty good shape with a stand density, regardless of whether you have 5 plants or 50 or 100 plants per square foot. So it's really an important thing to look at the numbers of stems per square foot. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is weed management, and I think it's particularly important during stand establishment period to do a good job of weed management, whether it's through organic methods if you're doing a combination of grazing or clipping, or in the case of traditional conventional herbicides, or if you've decided to try the Roundup Ready concept, which all of those can be effective methods of weed management. But going back to this issue that you have this very, very weak small seedling, essentially all of our winter weeds are more aggressive than alfalfa is at that stage of development. Now, if you can get alfalfa past that wimpy stage to the stage where it's a vigorous perennial with a well-developed root system, that essentially very few weeds can compete under those conditions. So the best technique, or you call it integrated pest management technique for prevention of weed intrusion, is a vigorous alfalfa stand. So the more things you can do, that's why we feel that 60% of your success is in that stand establishment period, where you're putting together a crop that will sustain weed intrusion and even insect and disease pressures over time in that initial period. And there are a range of weed control options available to you. They differ in their effects on the crop. I think if you turn the page from that, we have a whole series that I've listed here. These are some of the herbicides that are used. Gramoxone is a little bit of a scorched earth concept during the stand establishment. We tend to, it's fairly non-selective. You can use it. It's really, you got to be real careful. It's basically a foliar burn down. So all of these herbicides to varying degrees will have some crop injury characteristics, some more than others. And so one of the things about Roundup Ready that's come along recently is the lack of crop injury that you see during that stand establishment period. Essentially, very limited crop injury, and of course you have broad spectrum weed control. But either conventional or Roundup Ready concept has been proved to be successful if you use those techniques correctly and follow the label in all cases. And for organic farmers, I would particularly recommend the early planting techniques and techniques like pre-irrigation. Well, those are actually important for everybody, but pre-irrigation to take care of weed intrusions that you might have developed over time. Because if you decide to just go in late in the year and take your chances, you're likely to run into trouble. And I've seen quite a few organic folks, well, traditional, conventional farmers that run into that kind of problem as well. They go in too late of the year. The first harvest of the year. Well, we would generally state that that first harvest of an early planting has to be as late as you possibly can make it. Again, you're farming for the roots. You're farming for the below ground structure, not for the crop production. And so the key issue there is to provide enough time for that crop to develop fully. So I would look for a late harvest on that first year, and then after that you can institute your regular cutting schedule types of approaches. So these are some of the packages of practices that we would recommend. I don't know if Cannon or Phil, you wanted to add anything to that, anything that you found to be particularly useful on stand establishment techniques?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
With the Roundup Ready, it's not a stand establishment issue, but it does not mean that you don't have to use some pre-emergent herbicide at some time or another, because Roundup is a post-emergent herbicide, and
Right.
if you get like the late season grasses and things that show up, I mean, you can get dead grass with a swather. You don't need to spray it with Roundup. What you want is you don't want the grass in the bale to begin with.
Right.
So we put on TR10 or something like that.
Well,
we have a groundsel problem in the wintertime, and so at some point you have to use a dormant spray.
Kind of a mixture between the different herbicides.
I think we're going to try to use some Belfar on Roundup Ready just to mix the chemistries.
Yeah,
So
that's a very good point. In fact, one of the dangers that is rapidly being recognized in the case of Roundup resistant field crops, including cotton and particularly cotton and corn and soybeans in the Midwest and the South, is the development of Roundup resistant weeds. And when the first technology came out, what is it, about 15 years ago now, the weed scientists raised their hands and said, we're going to get Roundup resistant weeds. And they were right. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's not really the result of the Roundup resistant crops so much as it is the frequent applications of a single herbicide. And the frequent applications of any herbicide will likely result over millions and millions of acres, which is what we're doing with Roundup, is going to result in a greater likelihood of resistance. And it's something that we really have to watch with our alfalfa crop now that Roundup Ready alfalfa is out there. We have a publication that we've already developed 2 or 3 years ago before it was authorized about methods to prevent this, which involve exactly what Phil what's your name, Tom?
Tom.
Tom was suggesting is don't just rely on Roundup. It's not a good strategy when it comes to Roundup resistant weeds, and we know this fully well. We know about Roundup, resistance of herbicides. It's actually a problem with other herbicides even more than it is with Roundup, but Roundup gets a lot of attention because we have millions of acres of these Roundup resistant crops. And in addition to that, everybody's spraying their ditch banks and so forth. So you get the combination of the ditch banks and the kind of the roadside type of applications along with crop production, and it does create a weed biology problem that we really have to be aware of.
Any comments on inoculating alfalfa seed?
Oh, yeah, a good question about inoculation of alfalfa seed. On ranches like, I believe this one that's been growing alfalfa for how many years, Phil? Probably over 100 years on this particular ranch. We probably would not see a response to inoculation in all likelihood, because you have plenty of rhizobium. And for those of you who are not familiar with alfalfa, alfalfa is a nitrogen fixer. So we don't recommend, by the way, if you wanted to ask that question about fertilizers, we never recommend, or I wouldn't say never, but hardly ever recommend a nitrogen fertilizer to be applied to an alfalfa crop. Generally speaking, and we have new data actually last year on this, that it fixes about 85 to 90% of its nitrogen needs from the atmosphere alone. And it might take up a little bit of residual nitrogen from the soil based upon the crop rotation and whatever nitrogen is there, but it's very small compared with 300 to 500 or 600 pounds of nitrogen it actually takes off the field every year. It's all basically coming from biological N2 fixation, and so on fields where it's a question, I would highly recommend inoculation, and it's probably a good policy just for the sake of an insurance policy, to have that inoculant there. But I would say if you did a controlled study on fields like these that have had long history of continuous alfalfa production, you would probably not see a response to inoculation. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't inoculate the seed. I think it's like in any insurance policy, and maybe 1 out of 10 times you might benefit from it. So it's probably a good idea to keep that inoculum in there. I didn't mention. Go ahead.
Any new research on drip irrigation for alfalfa?
Oh, yes, and it's been. I think in terms of both grower experience, we're starting a new drip irrigation trial at UC Davis, where we put it in this last year. There are some new fields that have gone in different parts of the state. There's some in Imperial Valley in Arizona, Coachella in the Fresno County area, and then the Bowles Ranch here had a drip field in for 2 years.
We.
And they were raising a good crop of gophers, and they decided to yank it out. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean the alfalfa's still there. We just are irrigating it conventionally.
Okay.
That was the vertebrates or that was what brought us down.
Yeah. Let me just give you a little sense of where my thinking is on drip irrigation, and Phil and Cannon, if you wanted to chime in, this would be great. But there is evidence for increased yields with drip irrigation, both experimental evidence and also grower experiences where they've looked at drip irrigation and have measured increased yields on their ranches compared with check flood irrigation. It has the advantage of the concept is that you can irrigate that crop right up until your harvest, and you can also apply small amounts of water where previously with check flood systems you could only apply a very small amount, or I mean very large amounts of water. You're basically stuck with a 4 to 6 inch irrigation every irrigation event, whereas with drip irrigation systems you can make a decision, well, I just need to give it a ½ an inch or an inch now, and that's all I need to do. And so the concept is you can irrigate it right up until the point of where you dry it down for harvest, and I think that's what you folks were doing with your drip field, right? You were irrigating very close to the harvest time, and you can also maybe even start it earlier right afterwards, right?
Oh yeah, you can start immediately.
And so that's really an advantage, and where probably some of that yield boost may come from is from this ability to avoid periodic droughts, which we have in check flood fields where we have periodic droughts. You basically have to dry that field down for 10 to 12 days with check flood systems, and you have no choice. So that's on the positive side of things. On the negative side of things, it's as the vertebrate pest specialist at Kearney told me, he says, you're essentially developing an ideal habitat for gophers and rodents and other kinds of folks. You have plenty of cover to protect it from wildlife. You don't disturb the field, which means you're not disturbing their burrows, and you're not flooding the burrows, and so you have plenty of food, you have plenty of shelter, and you have water. So you're doing everything in favor of the rodents. So those people that have successfully and have really had to ratchet up their gopher management systems to a very high level and perhaps an expensive level and to make this work. And so that's probably the major negative at this point in time. But there are some farms that have been doing this, and we're going to be continuing to experiment with it in terms of how you can manage that major pest problem that you have in alfalfa fields. So that's probably the major negative. We get gophers all the time in alfalfa fields anyway. We get them in sprinkler irrigation systems in a big way, but they don't ruin the irrigation system like they do with berry drip.
Have you experimented with different beds, small beds? And it seems like some growers around here are trying that. Yeah,
bedded alfalfa is a practice that's been around for a long time. Do you do any bedded alfalfa here?
With drip.
Oh, with drip.
With drip.
Yes, some people have done that. The bedded alfalfa, the major advantage of bedded alfalfa is it moves water off of the crowns and moves it down the field more readily, so you don't get ponding in the field, which is deadly for this crop. If you keep water ponded on these fields, you can kill alfalfa plants pretty readily, and so we need to have that water moving down the field. It's really a soil type specific practice, like in the Blythe area and also in the Brawley area down in Southern California. They do bedded alfalfa in a big way because they have very heavy soils, and it really helps to move that water down those fields, and also prevent this ponding that takes place on the surface of the fields. On sandier soils, you can't even keep the beds from falling apart, so it really makes no sense on sandier soils. So it's a really soil type dependent practice, but we do a lot of it up in western Yolo County, up where we are there, and they do it here. How wide are your beds here?
Oh, they're doing them on like a 40-inch.
40-inch, so
It's kind of listed. There's not really a huge bed. It's more
just a kind of a corrugation. We call it sort of a corrugation.
Yeah, it's more corrugated.
Yeah, so there's a lot of modifications of it, and the ones down in Brawley, they'll do a ditch that's basically that deep, and they're about 20 to 24-inch wide, and so they're really different than the beds we see around here. And so people have experimented with different kinds of bed. On heavier soils, they really make a lot of sense, mainly to move that water down the field.
It keeps the harrow bed guy from shortcutting across the
Yeah, that's another advantage. And actually, some of the growers who have done the best job with it, they've modified all of their equipment to go in those ditches, and that alone is actually an important thing because you're keeping that traffic off of those fields. And we've measured traffic influence on alfalfa fields of, on average, for 2 trips with a small tractor at UC Davis. We did 2 trips, one at 3 days and one at 7 days, kind of to mimic what happens in real fields. We saw a 25% yield decline on the areas where you get traffic. So traffic is a big issue with alfalfa, and I think one of the things we look for in the future is to look for controlled traffic technologies, which we've seen with other crops. We haven't seen as much with alfalfa, and part of it is you got all these different companies that are doing different equipment, and they all have different wheel spacings, and it's a little bit formidable, but I think that there is an incentive there on wheel traffic control to improve upon that.
That's going to be a lot more important with the low lignin varieties too.
Because of the...
They won't be able to stand up to the vehicle traffic.
Right. I just thinking, yeah, I think that's probably right. We're seeing, we had a comparison amongst varieties which we didn't think was that interesting, because you do see some differences between varieties, but we haven't tested low lignin for traffic yet, so we'll look at that. I wanted to talk about variety issues. Anybody here selling seed? Somebody willing to say that they were. Okay, so I'll talk just briefly about varieties, and then I think I'll touch on a little bit on water quality, because I think I talked with Pete this morning about water quality issues. Varieties, we do testing of alfalfa varieties all over the state of California. We have 2 sites in Fresno County, one on the east side, one on the west side. And the first page of this is on your handout here. Selection of a variety is almost like getting married. Some actually marriages don't last as long as alfalfa fields. But it's, you should think that at least you spend, 15 or 20 minutes or half an hour, or maybe even an hour thinking about something that you're going to live with for about 3, 4, 5, 6 years. So that's my my spiel here, is just study the issue a little bit to make sure that what choice you're making makes some sense. So the first thing that I would ask you is it worth it to look at higher yielding varieties? So if you backtrack a little bit in your handout here to, I don't have page numbers on here unfortunately, but in here there's a graph here, and this graph shows the economic value due only to variety choice. Okay, so what I did here is I took the data from our variety trials, and this one was at, can't remember, UC Davis, but we see the same kind of thing at our other locations, so it's really similar. And I said, okay, I'm going to give the lowest yielding variety in there a value of 0. Okay, so lowest yielding variety in our test. And then as you get higher yields with the higher yielding varieties, I'm going to multiply that yield times the average price of alfalfa hay. And in this case I used $200 a ton. Okay, what's the price of alfalfa today?
Not far from that.
Pretty close to that, isn't it? So it's not too bad. So in this case what I did is I calculated out over a 3-year period, 3-year data set. This is actual data from our 2009 through 2011 data set, the increment in yield or return that you would get from choosing a different variety. Okay, and so you can get up to well over $1,000 per acre over those 2 or 3 year periods from just the variety selection and just based upon yield alone. Okay, so there are some differences that you often can't see, and the thing that I always point out to people, maybe Joe can walk out here and tell me what the variety is. Maybe you sold him the variety, so maybe you know.
5099.
Is this 5099? Okay. And so I could not tell you whether that's the best variety or not for this field. The only way you can really tell is if you put them side by side and you carefully either observe them, harvest them with your swather and count bales, or take weights, or put into small plot trials like the ones we have at the UC system and measure them carefully. Because even in those variety trials, you look at one, you look at the other, well, I don't know if I tell the difference between those two, but you weigh them and you say, well, okay, this one is yielding more than this one over here. And so oftentimes growers, will invite me to their field and they'll blame the variety. They won't know whether it's the variety or not. And really the only way you can do that is do your own little strip trials, and we always recommend people to do their strip trials because you can actually observe some differences in the field.
Same thing with cotton, Dan.
Is that right?
It's not something you can just see.
You just can't see those variety differences, and we do a real, we really try hard. We have little experimental chopper, harvesters where you go in and you weigh, a certain length, and you carefully, weigh the fresh weights and the dry weights to estimate dry matter percentage, and you try to compare them on a dry matter basis. So it's a long involved process, but it gives you data that's like this. And so what we would recommend in this chart here, and I've got the data on the end of this handout here, I would look at approximately the top third of this trial, because there is an experimental error or variation in our ability to measure the yields. But I'm pretty confident that the top third of these trials are going to be pretty high yielding, high yield potential varieties. And I would use that as my group of high yielding varieties and then choose amongst those based upon other characteristics. So if I go into my, if you go back here, steps for choosing an alfalfa variety. Number one, choose a group of high yielding varieties. And And if the seed company doesn't provide that to you, we have them on our website at UC Davis. We post them as soon as they're available, and you can look them up. I've got the website on the cover page here. You can look it up. We'll have the new variety trial data out late this summer as soon as we collect enough yield data for this year. And so that's the number one criteria, is the yield potential. Number two, we would look at fall dormancy levels. And the reason fall dormancy is important in some areas, for example, on flooding prone soils, for example, where you have a low-lying area next to a river or something that's flood prone, I would possibly recommend a little bit lower dormancy for that kind of situation, because they're not going to be as winter active during the risky months where you're having a possibility of flooding in that area. So that's one of the reasons you look at a low dormancy group. Maybe they're not the highest yielding, but they might survive a little bit better under those flooded conditions. The second thing is that low dormancy almost always gives you, at the same cutting schedule, a little better quality. Lower yield, but better quality.
Lower number.
Pardon?
Lower number dormancy. Not
Yeah, a lower number dormancy. Yeah, there we go. A more dormant variety, like the ones they grow up in Minnesota and those areas. We have people in the northern San Joaquin Valley here who grow fall dormancy 4s, and they grow them specifically for their high quality characteristics. I'm convinced that they probably economically take it on the chin with some of those varieties because of the lower yields they're likely to get. We've estimated at UC Davis trials that an average of about 1.5 ton to maybe 2 tons yield penalty from going from an 8 to down to about a 4 at that environment, fall dormancy 4. So I think there's some happy medium in there, probably 6s and 7s that are high yielding and a little better in quality than the 8s and 9s. Fall dormancy is a characteristic of a crop to grow in the fall of the year. So it's winter active, it has a high dormancy level. If it's not that winter active, if you see it turning into a rosette out there, it's probably a low dormancy group. And we grow the I got to get to your nomenclature. The low number for fall dormancy, which are fall dormancies 3s and 4s primarily, are grown in the Intermountain area of California. They're grown in the upper Midwest, and we don't grow them other than for quality, which I just mentioned, in the San Joaquin Valley as widely as we do the 6, 7s, and 8s, which are the most common for this area here. An occasional 9 maybe as you get further south. The 9s, 10s, and 11s are the ones that we grow down in the Imperial Valley of California and Mexico and Arizona, which are the most appropriate for that area. And again, down there you would take an even bigger yield hit by growing a fall dormancy 4, 5, or 6 down in that region down there. So fall dormancy is important. Third, pest resistance characteristics, and this is really important for alfalfa. We have some of the best genetics for pest resistance of any crop plant, corn, soybeans, cotton, and so forth. There's a wide range of aphid resistance, nematode resistance, and you should take advantage of those breeding efforts that have been going on. The seed companies are all out there competing for your business, making sure that they have good pest resistance characteristics. So for this area here, we would always recommend a good aphid resistance package for spotted alfalfa aphid, pea aphid, and blue alfalfa aphid. So you look for high levels of resistance to Phytophthora, and these are widely available. Essentially all the new varieties have these levels of resistance, and those are pretty important. Fusarium wilt. The one problem we've had that we haven't been able to solve as readily as we'd hoped is stem nematode. We do have high levels of resistance to stem nematode. Some of the varieties that have had high levels of resistance have been a little disappointing, and unfortunately, but it's often the only technique we have to really try to combat this, and we need to keep asking the seed companies, which are mostly private companies at this point, to continually try to look for these higher levels of resistance to stem nematode, because we've had continual problems with that issue. I think in this area too. Have you seen any on this farm here?
No,
This side of the highway, you're fairly safe. It's more on the west side.
It's more on the west side, and then as you get into the Stockton and Tracy area, we've seen a lot of infestations up in that area. We've seen it up in the Sacramento Valley. Stem nematode has been a really big issue. As you get further south, I don't think it's as big of an issue down there, but we've seen some big problems with that. And verticillium wilt is one that we don't really see in the valley, but you go up to the intermountain area and you would look for high levels of resistance there. So take advantage of that. A lot of times when we're talking about IPM, we don't talk about things like variety selection, and it's really an important issue, particularly for alfalfa, because we do have all of these resistances that we can take advantage of. And the next thing is the Biotech Traits, and this is mainly the Roundup Ready trait at this point in time, and we've already talked about that to some degree. Basically, when you're buying a Roundup Ready variety, you're not just buying a variety, you're buying a weed control approach that you have to evaluate as a separate kind of issue. Look for evidence of better persistence. So there are varieties that actually persist better than others, even within the same dormancy group, although generally the lower dormancy groups, that is the lower numbers, will give you a little better persistence under cutting schedules that we commonly do here. Forage quality is another important issue, but keep in mind that forage quality is always related to yield. So if a seed company comes up to you and says, I got a really high quality variety here, the next question should be, well, how does it yield? Because if you're trading off 1 or 2 tons worth of yield for a higher quality variety, that may or may not be worth your while. And generally speaking, the economic analysis that we've done for crop production has shown that basically yield almost always wins over quality when it comes to returns to the grower. The dairyman who buys your hay doesn't really care how much it yields. They care how much the TDN or protein or per ton. They don't care how many tons per acre you get. So, but you as a grower will have to care about that. And so if you calculate out the forage quality premium required to make up for a half ton or a 1 ton or a 1.5 ton yield penalty, that's an important calculation to make. Whether the calculation is based upon cutting schedule, because we know that earlier cutting schedules give you higher quality, or whether or not it's based upon variety, because we know that dormant varieties gives you, generally speaking, the same cutting schedule will give you a little higher quality than a non-dormant variety. Let's see now. So the last thing, of course, is to make sure that the price is reasonable and that they give you a fairly decent hat. Every time I talk about hats, in sort of a disparaging way, I lose my ability to collect my seed company hats, and I'm sort of disappointed at that. Joe, can you help me out here? Okay. So anyway, I really enjoy the seed company hats, but they've been penalizing me because I tell them that that's the last thing you should look at when you're looking at alfalfa varieties. But I've got some yield data here that you're welcome to take a look at. If people ask me specifically which variety to plant, I usually I'm saying what do you call that, an agnostic or something. We work with all the seed companies. We represent the data the way it comes out, and if sometimes the seed companies win and sometimes they don't, but we're sort of the independent arbiters of that data, and we present it in a way that everybody can take a look at it. And so I would, like, generally speaking, say I'd look at the top third, approximately the top third of these trials, and look at that as my high yielding group of varieties. Now, I want to say one thing, because I think your agency is very concerned about water quality. You're funded by the Water Quality Board. Yep. Chlorpyrifos. Let's talk about chlorpyrifos. Let's hope it's only a 5-minute conversation. I don't know if it'll be more than that. Chlorpyrifos actually just got news yesterday, and I think, Philip, I sent out a notice to the CAFA board that chlorpyrifos is going to have new rules associated with Lorsban and what are the other formulations? Lock-on. As of this fall, EPA will have new national rules for the use of Lorsban and chlorpyrifos. particularly related to buffer areas around schools and human habitation, as well as the rates are going to be different, particularly for aerial applications. And I don't know this for sure. Anybody know how many of our applications in California are going to be by air? It's going to be a majority, right? I think it's going to be like 75 or 80% maybe by air, and so that essentially all of our aerial applications will be under new restrictions as of the fall of this year. And I'm circulating amongst the California Alfalfa and Forage Association members, and also the Alfalfa Work Group, which is the University of California, farm advisors and specialists who work in alfalfa on, what are the meanings of these new regulations, and whether they're going to have any impact on our ability to control insect pests in alfalfa. And one thing I didn't see in that new regulation, maybe somebody else can, because I didn't read it because it just came last night in real detail, but I don't know whether it has those new regulations are focused on the water quality issues as much as the drift issues. It looks like it's more drift to me, but I don't know. Yeah, and so you get this volatility issue, and so they reduce the rates, and they're very concerned about human health, issues with around schools and everything. So there's going to be restrictions around schools and any public building, any human habitation. But in California, Chlorpyrifos has been our bane, I guess you'd call it, of water quality issues, and alfalfa is a big player in that. Alfalfa is one of the biggest users of Chlorpyrifos in the state of California. Probably alfalfa and orchards are the two biggest crops where Lorsban or Chlorpyrifos is used. We've known about this issue for a number of years. The key issue has to do with water management and how the product is managed. There are a number of alfalfa fields that do not have any runoff. The entire, essentially, Intermountain area, they use sprinklers, so they don't essentially have zero runoff. In the southern San Joaquin Valley, very few of those fields have significant runoff. But we do have significant runoff in this northern part of the San Joaquin Valley. I don't know how many of your fields drain into sloughs and water, what we call waters of the state, but certainly some of them will in this region around here. We're in a low-lying area, the Delta area. Some of those Delta islands, essentially 30-40% of the water that comes onto those Delta islands ends up coming off of those islands. In the Sacramento Valley, a very high percentage of those fields that are near the sloughs and rivers do have drainage that goes into those natural waterways. And in the case of Chlorpyrifos, the amount of product that is capable of affecting the test organisms is very, very small. It's considered toxic at very, very low levels, which is part of our problem here. And we're talking about parts per trillion. I'm not sure if it's like 5 or 30 parts per trillion. Anybody know what a part per trillion is?
Very small. 1,000 of a part.
And it's not a part per million, folks. It's not a part per billion. It's a part per trillion. All right, so I had a grower up, and do you know what it is? Tell me. What a part per trillion is.
Right off the top of my head, but it's 1/10,000th of a part per million.
Okay.
Maybe I'm off by 1.
I think you're off by 1, but I did some calculations along with the irrigation specialist at UC Davis, because Tom Ellis, a member of our CAFA board, came to us and said, "Okay, tell me what is this? What's a part per trillion?" And we came up with the following: in a single irrigation in an 80-acre field, it's a few drops. So you have, a 4 to 6 inch irrigation, give or take, 20 or 30 parts per trillion. You have a few drops in that irrigation, which is why it's probably very, very difficult to envision why or how we can prevent this compound from exiting fields that are right near sloughs and waterways. It's going to be toxic, or at least detectable at very, very small levels. And so I guess my feeling is that I would recommend that if you are irrigating fields in such a way that significant parts of those waters are coming off of those fields directly into sloughs and waterways, that I would forego using Chlorpyrifos, or look at buffering around the edges or something like that that would prevent that from moving off those fields. A series of of mitigation measures have been thought through and actually implemented by some growers, and that includes recirculation systems within a farm. So if you're moving water from one field to another, that certainly is a way of mitigating the effects of Chlorpyrifos runoff. If you have recirculation systems within the same field where you're pumping water back up to the top of the field and re-irrigating that field, that's another irrigation method that can prevent this from happening. And there are also other concepts which are more experimental. For example, having small holding areas and with enzymatic breakdown of the Chlorpyrifos in those holding areas, and those have been worked on to some degree. They're not 100% there yet. So, but I think it's something we need to be aware of. There is a danger. I think those of us involved with agriculture would like to see us maintain the tools that are effective and safe. And certainly the off-site movement of pesticides is something that nobody wants to see. Agriculturalists and certainly the general public does not want to see that. And so it's something that we have to be very aware of over time. So,
Dan, we talked earlier in the cotton discussion about monitoring nodes above white flower. In earlier meetings we talked about the use of the pressure chamber. We talked about sometimes soil moisture deficits. We talk about measuring growth and vigor in a plant and relating that back to our irrigation management approaches. What are some of the primary? Alfalfa uses a lot of water. What are some of the primary tools?
well, it's a matter of opinion.
Well, it uses more than cotton, I think.
It does.
So what are the primary tools that are used to manage and schedule irrigation so that some of the runoff issues can also be dealt with in that way?
There are a range of tools that are used. First of all, the comment was that alfalfa uses a lot of water, and I have to admit that this is true. But keep in mind that this is a perennial crop that grows from about February through about November. Actually, if you look at water use efficiency issues, this is one of the sort of misconceptions that people have about alfalfa. It's actually relatively water use efficient compared with many crops. And it's almost as if you took a spinach crop and kept growing spinach all year long, you'd come up with approximately the same answer. In fact, alfalfa would probably be superior to that crop in terms of water use efficiency as defined by dry matter produced per unit area in relationship to the water used. So the big issue is one of matching the true irrigation needs of the crop, which in this area is going to be about 4 to 4.5. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah.
4.5 acre feet per year.
So based on 6 cuttings, yeah.
Based upon a six or 7 cut in some cases. I guess you get 6 here.
7th cutting, yeah.
So sometimes a 7th cutting or a grazing in the winter time. So that's about 48 to 52 inches per year. The biggest issue is making sure that your irrigation methods approximately match that demand by the crop effectively. And with check flood irrigation, we have the issue of controlling individual runoff events. Now, runoff is itself not a problem as long as that water is effectively used somewhere downstream, and that's really one of the issues that growers have tried to point out to folks at the Department of Water Resources that actually some runoff is necessary in case of controlling salts, but also can be recovered in terms of other crops. In terms of techniques to monitor irrigations, we use soil moisture monitoring. We would recommend a combination of using following ET with soil moisture monitoring. Now, alfalfa presents a tremendous challenge when you're thinking about irrigation management, because essentially you have this very large interfering activity called harvest. And you really have to negotiate your irrigation applications around your harvest schedule. So if you're at a 28 to 32, you're probably at 30-day schedules here. 28?
28, later in the summer we'll go to 30,
maybe 32 or something.
Is our ideal.
28's a pretty common schedule, so you got a 4-week schedule, and in the case of...
This field is 28 today.
Today it's 28 days? Okay.
So you know.
And you're probably planning on cutting it pretty soon, right?
Yeah, next couple of days. It's averaged about 1.25 tons the last 3 cuttings.
Okay, we were trying to guess what the yields would
It'll be right at the same.
I'd say about 1.2 right here.
Quality's been not so great.
Yeah, because you got some bloom out here, you get a lot of heat stress here now, and so basically growers, depending upon soil type, with check flood systems, are faced with the prospect of either 1 irrigation, 2 irrigations, or 3 irrigations per cutting cycle. And here you're probably doing 2, right?
Just one.
Just 1. Okay, so here they're doing 1.
Part, agronomically, it might make sense to irrigate it twice or even 3 times, but then you go to harvest it and you've got wet field conditions and a hell of a mess. So.
And it pushes, and because you have wet conditions, it pushes that schedule later, and you really cannot get in there and harvest on time, and so this is a big problem. So the ET method, the SIMUS method that we would recommend that growers follow an ET concept, I still recommend that growers do that, but it's very difficult for them to do because of the interference of cutting schedules. So they have this sort of practical issue that comes into play, and so they're forced into either a single irrigation or 2 irrigations. But I still think the growers should be following their ET demands, and those, I think probably Bowles Farming does that, right? You do follow your ET.
Yeah, we look at that, but again, there's a lot, other than with the drip, you really can't control.
There's not a whole lot you can do.
It makes you feel like a chump, so it's better not to look at it. But with the drip, we found we cut the alfalfa water use almost in half. I mean,
with the drip.
Shocking how
Well, this is one of the promising things about drip irrigation is that you can control very small irrigations, very frequent irrigations, which we think are more agronomically advantageous to the crop production, and also can save water, particularly in saving runoff issues with those fields. And so I think this is something that we need to look at in the future if we can control the damage done by rodents. So we would always recommend a combination of soil moisture monitoring, because oftentimes it's been my observation that the growers actually don't know what's going on down below the ground. If you don't do soil moisture monitoring, either by the old-fashioned way of taking probes and actually looking and probing the soil, and by look and feel you can see where the water front has gone, or by sensors, which can, a lot of them are very cheap and inexpensive and can be used to monitor soil moisture over time. We did some projects on soil moisture monitoring on about 10 or 12 fields in the Intermountain area. Steve Orloff did this, and the growers had no idea which field was theirs. And some of the fields were being over-irrigated, and some fields were being under-irrigated quite severely. They just didn't know how much water they were getting down past, say, 6 inches or a foot. And so with alfalfa, we need to maintain that moisture level down at about 2 to 3 feet, because at this periodic dry down that we have to do for the crop, we really have to have that residual moisture there to carry that crop through that swathing, raking, and harvesting and bale removal period. Otherwise, you get lots of stress, and the crop really cannot recover adequately upon rewatering afterwards. So I would use a combination of those 2 techniques. I think we can do a better job of irrigation management. I think throughout California, some farmers do a very good job of it and others don't. And also simple techniques like utilizing, like we have a engineer at Davis who's used a machine for calling your cell phone when the water reaches a certain point, so that wakes up the irrigator in the middle of the night and makes sure that they shut off the water. And we all know that the irrigators are really a key player here in our farming systems, and oftentimes they don't have the most modern techniques available to them. So I think this is the kind of thing that we need to look at in the future. I think I'm going to stand between everybody and lunch, so I better probably... Any other questions, or anybody want to vehemently disagree with me? The only rule is... Yeah, you're going to disagree?
I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm going to kind of help close it up. Kind of speaking for Marcia and the sustainable farming community, one of the things based on your last topic you talked about with the Lors ban, I would certainly like to join you guys in sort of trying to characterize in our alfalfa growers kind of what the use of Lors ban is, what the pests, what the alternatives are, what alternatives are out there, other alternatives we might be able to bring in. And so as part of your year-end survey or something, we can kind of gather that information. If you respond to it, that'd be great. But I think to characterize that first and then come back and say, well, what do we need to address in terms of either learning how to use a reduced rate of Lors ban, or better yet, what are the alternatives we have, and are there other alternatives we can go out and get that may or may not be there yet. So
Even a partial response now would be helpful because the National Alfalfa Growers Association wants comments by August 10th, I think.
No, it's late July here.
Anyway, they want to have comments going to the EPA right now about the proposed regulations. Now, I was reading them yesterday. It looks like some of what they're talking about is stuff that we're already dealing with in California.
Yeah.
Now, we forget that in the other 49 states, people are farming like it's 1932. So some of the stuff may not be that onerous for us, but it is, I mean, the alternatives that we're looking at are, from a sustainability standpoint, worse. They knock out all the beneficial.
well, it's also a limited amount of. I mean, there's some good aphid materials out there, but they haven't been registered on alfalfa.
That's the biggest problem.
And that's what we need to figure out is can we help NAPA or the local organization
We're stuck.
see some special local needs
Worms,
or
we got a
some,
lot of good material.
yeah.
Well,
Maybe
and-
need some struggling for some Section 18s, that kind
It's
of
the
thing.
weevils and aphids are the biggest problem, aren't they?
Not really weevil either.
Not as much weevils. It's the aphids you haven't. Okay.
Well, that's what it's used primarily. That's what you really don't have a whole lot of alternatives against.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we really need to do is more work on softer chemistries over time, so that on these water-sensitive areas, we need to look at different kinds of chemistries. So,
We know it's there. It's a matter of getting it.
yeah.
A special local needs label or a Section 18 for a particular area based upon, environmental concerns and just the lack of control. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that the sustainable farming community can help kind of organize and push. So I just put that out there.
Okay. Well, we thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Dan, for joining us. First